In the heart of Belgrade, the air is thick with chants and the pulse of defiance. Since November 2024, Serbia has been gripped by its largest anti-government protests in decades, sparked by a tragic collapse of a railway station canopy in Novi Sad that killed 16 people. What began as a public outcry against corruption and negligence has swelled into a broader movement, with over 660 demonstrations nationwide, some drawing crowds of up to 140,000. Students, professors, workers and veterans have united under slogans like "We want elections" and "No more bloody shirts," demanding the resignation of President Aleksandar Vučić and an end to his 12-year rule. For many, these protests evoke memories of Ukraine's 2014 Euromaidan uprising, a pivotal moment that reshaped a nation's trajectory. But is this Serbia's maiden moment? And how does this unrest fit into the West's broader strategy to counter Russian influence under Vladimir Putin? The collapse of the Novi Sad railway station canopy on November 1, 2024 was more than a structural failure. It was a symbol of systemic rot. Critics pointed to corruption and negligence in state infrastructure projects, fueling public outrage. Students, in particular, have led the charge, organising blockades and marches that have shaken Vučić's Serbian Progressive Party, SNS, which has held power since 2012. The resignation of Prime Minister Milos Vučević in early 2025 was a partial victory, but protesters remain steadfast, demanding snap elections and systemic reform. These protests are not just about domestic grievances. They carry a geopolitical weight, echoing the 2014 Euromaidan protests in Ukraine, where mass demonstrations toppled a pro-Russian government. In Serbia, the unrest has exposed the country's precarious position straddling east and west, with Vučić's government historically balancing ties with Russia while pursuing EU membership. The protests, largely student-led and pro-democratic, have drawn comparisons to Ukraine's revolution, raising questions about whether Serbia is at a similar turning point. In late 2013, Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych, under pressure from Moscow, scrapped plans for an EU association agreement, triggering the Euromaidan protests. Hundreds of thousands took to the streets, demanding a pro-Western pivot and an end to corruption.
Well, despite the unprecedented pressure on Serbia, we cannot exclude the use of well-known technologies aimed at provoking color revolutions. However, we have no doubt that the current Serbian leadership will soon restore law and calm in the republic.
The movement culminated in Yanukovych's ouster in February 2014, followed by Russia's annexation of Crimea and the onset of conflict in eastern Ukraine. For Putin, Euromaidan was a color revolution, a Western-orchestrated coup threatening Russia's sphere of influence. Serbia's protests share striking parallels. Like Ukraine, Serbia's demonstrations were sparked by a specific grievance but have grown into a broader rejection of autocratic governance. Vučić, like Yanukovych, has been accused of consolidating power, eroding democratic institutions and maintaining close ties with Russia. Serbia's refusal to impose sanctions on Russia after the 2014 Crimea annexation and the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, combined with its reliance on Russian gas via the Turk Stream pipeline, has cemented Belgrade's image as a Russian ally in the Balkans. Yet, there are key differences. Ukraine's 2014 protests were explicitly pro-EU, driven by a desire to break free from Russia's orbit. Serbia's movement, while pro-democratic, is less uniformly pro-Western. Many Serbs harbour resentment toward the West, rooted in NATO's 1999 bombing campaign during the Kosovo War, which Russia opposed. This historical grudge, coupled with Russian soft power, bolstered by pro-Moscow media and cultural ties, complicates Serbia's trajectory. A 2022 poll showed 63% of Serbs blamed the West for the Russia-Ukraine war, and 46% favoured neutrality, reflecting a deep ambivalence about aligning fully with either side. Vučić himself has fueled the colour revolution narrative, accusing foreign agents of orchestrating the protests, a claim echoed by Serbia's Orthodox Church leader, Patriarch Porphyrić, during a Moscow visit in April 2025. Russian officials, including Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov, have similarly warned of Western meddling, framing the unrest as a repeat of Ukraine's 2014 coup. Is this Serbia's Euromaidan? Not quite. While the protests challenge Vučić's autocratic grip, they lack the clear pro-Western orientation that defined Ukraine's uprising. Serbia's geopolitical tightrope, balancing EU aspirations with Russian ties, means the movement could push the country in multiple directions. The EU sees an opportunity to support democratic change, urging reforms in rule of law and media freedom to align Serbia with European values. However, Vučić's government has resisted fully committing to either camp, signing deals with China, Egypt and South Korea while maintaining Russian energy and military ties. For Serbia to experience a true maiden moment, the protests would need to coalesce around a clear pro-Western vision, with a viable opposition to replace Vučić's regime. Currently, no such alternative exists, and the movement's focus remains on domestic accountability rather than foreign policy realignment. Moreover, Vučić's resilience, bolstered by loyalist counter-protests and media control, suggests he may weather the storm, unlike Yanukovych, who fled to Russia. The West's interest in Serbia's protests is undeniable. The EU and US view the unrest as a chance to weaken a government that has been a thorn in their side, maintaining close ties with Moscow while stalling EU accession talks. Reports of Russian intelligence assisting Serbia with protest surveillance and crowd control have raised alarms in Western capitals, reinforcing perceptions of Serbia as a Russian foothold in Europe. The US sanctions on Serbia's NIS energy company, previously majority owned by Russia's Gazprom, signal a push to curb Moscow's economic leverage. For Putin, Serbia's unrest is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it distracts the West from Ukraine, where Russia continues its military campaign. On the other, a pro-Western shift in Belgrade could undermine Russia's influence in the Balkans, a region Moscow sees as a buffer against NATO and the EU. Russia's playbook, disinformation, cyber attacks and support for loyal regimes, has been deployed to frame the protests as Western-backed, much as it did in Ukraine in 2014. Yet, Serbia's protests are largely organic, driven by domestic grievances rather than foreign manipulation, making Russia's narrative less effective. The West's strategy is not without risks. Pushing Serbia too hard toward the EU could alienate its pro-Russian population, fueling backlash. Russia has already exploited this, with media close to Moscow condemning Vučić for allegedly supplying arms to Ukraine via third countries, a claim Belgrade denies but which strains Serbia-Russia ties. If the protests topple Vučić, the West could gain a more aligned Serbia, but a power vacuum might also embolden pro-Russian factions, complicating the geopolitical landscape. Serbia's protests are a crucible for its future. They reflect a nation fed up with corruption and autocracy, yet divided over its place in the world. Unlike Ukraine's 2014 Euromaidan, which marked a decisive break from Russia, Serbia's movement is less about choosing sides and more about demanding accountability. For the West, it's a chance to nudge Serbia toward democratic reform and away from Putin's orbit, but missteps could entrench anti-Western sentiment. For Putin, it's a test of Russia's waning influence in a region where historical ties still resonate. As Belgrade streets pulse with protest, the world watches. Will Serbia redefine itself, or will it remain caught between East and West? The answer lies not in a single moment, but in the choices by its people, its leaders, and the powers vying for its allegiance that will shape the years to come.